Hello, my name is Paul Gilbert, and I'm president of the Compassionate Mind Foundation. And today it's a great privilege and a great honor to be able to talk to my colleague, Dr. Dan Siegel, who is, to my mind, one of the great minds when it comes to mental processing and all things mental. So he is, let me just tell you a little bit about him. So Dan is clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA. That's in California. He is also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, which focuses on the development of mindsight, teaches insight, empathy, and integration in individuals, families, and communities. Dr. Siegel has published extensively, and I have to say absolutely extensively, for both the professional and lay audience. His 5 New York Times bestsellers include Aware, The Science and Practice of Presence, Mind, A Journey to the Heart of Being Human, Brainstorm, The Power and Purpose of the Teenage Brain, and 2 books with Tina Payne Bryson, The Whole Brain Child, and No Drama Discipline. His other books include Intraconnected, which I suspect we'll concentrate a little bit on today, The Developing Mind, The Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, which is really quite a fundamental way of understanding mental health difficulties and how to help people with mental health difficulties, Mindsight, Mindful Brain, Mindful Therapist, and Becoming Aware. He's also written The Yes Brain and the Power of Showing Up with Tina Payne Bryson. Dr. Siegel also serves on as the founding editor of the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, which currently contains over 80 textbooks. For more information about his education programs, you can please visit his website, which we will show you in a moment. It's on the PowerPoint that's in front of you with some of his books that you can see there. So, Dan, how wonderful to see you.
Paul, fantastic to see you. Thank you for having me here for this conversation.
Yeah, wonderful. And thank you so much for all the fantastic work you've done. And I've been rereading your Intraconnected book, which is just extraordinary. So let's just start off a little bit with your background. So how did you get interested in all of this stuff on mindfulness and interconnectedness and mindful therapies and mindful brains?
Yeah, well, I think we all have personal journeys that are beneath and before any kind of professional journey we're on, or even ways we try to support public well-being or planetary health. And the personal journey of this body, Dan, I think started where the mind really wasn't a focus much of the family I grew up in. And so I was really intrigued, kind of at how the inner life existed, yet no one seemed to be talking about it. And then when I went off to college, I had the love of biology. So I was studying biochemistry and really wanted to know, what's the inner workings of the body in terms of, chemical transformations and things like that. And just by chance, I saw an advertisement to work on a suicide prevention service. And so I thought, I'm probably not particularly oriented that way or don't have any skills at that, but that sounds kind of intriguing. So I started that as a trainee and was taught to focus on the inner experience, the feelings, the meanings, the stories, the thought processes the individual would have calling into a suicide hotline, a phone service. And I think that was when I was 17. That really impacted me in this huge way, where it was not only was this a real world that you could communicate with other people about, but it could be a matter of life and death. Literally, if you were compassionate by tuning into the inner world and caring about that inner world and bearing witness to that inner world, someone could make a choice to not end their lives. And they're just on the end of the phone. That's all you've got is your compassion. So I think then as an adolescent, the middle of my adolescence, I was struck by not only the importance of it, but how in my own family it was missing. And then when I went off to medical school, thinking, oh, what a great way to combine my interest in human beings and care of them with, my training as a scientist in biology. The absence of seeing the mind in medicine was so painful. I ended up dropping out. That's kind of what the book Mind is about. Is like, can you have a mind but it's invisible, and so that's when I made up the word after dropping out and decided to come back, mind sight, for just a simple perceptual ability to see the inner workings of yourself for insight, or of someone else for empathy. And when you care about it and do something about it, that's your beautiful work, Paul, and compassion. So mindsight fits right into that. It's in many ways a deep integrative experience, compassion, where you're allowing yourself to be differentiated from another, but linking with them in a full way where you receive their suffering. um, so that's an integration process that ultimately I'd kind of wonder about later on. But anyway, that's a long story for the personal journey of this body, and how compassion and connection and mindfulness and the mind and all that stuff uh, became, a part of my personal life more uh, explicitly, and my professional life absolutely explicitly.
Yeah, I wonder if I could push you on that a little bit because, I mean, I'm sure a number of people might have had similar experiences to you, but the way in which you've used those experiences is quite extraordinary. I mean, so you experienced working on a helpline for people with suicide, but many people do that sort of thing. But what sort of inspired you and what's guided you to this really deep and fundamental way of thinking about the mind and the incredible, prolific work that you've done? I mean, what do you think it's inside of you that put you on that course?
I don't think I've ever been asked that, Paul. So this is a great moment of just thank you for the question. So a feeling of sadness comes up when you ask the question, and also a feeling of exuberance at the same time. It's kind of this funny inner experience at this moment. In my body, I feel this kind of heaviness in my chest, and at the same time, this kind of energy in my belly. So if I were to try to translate those bodily sensations with your question, it would be something like, and now this is trying to make meaning of these feelings and, the memories of, this life. I would say that, there was an adaptation to a very sad, disconnected family life. I don't usually talk about it. My mom, we're just celebrating her 94th birthday, and my dad, who's pretty much the source of the lack of compassion, is gone now. We just buried him, uh, even though he's been gone for 11 years. We just did his burial 11 years later. So, maybe I'm feeling liberated now to talk about it after all these years. Um, so I think the sadness of that lack of connection, um, when the suicide prevention service happened, when I dropped out of medical school and went on a journey of discovery, just to try not to conform to, you know, the system. The first system would be my family system. The second system would be the medical system. And when I dropped out, I thought I don't want to participate in a field that is so mindless. It was the word I would use back then. We're talking 1979, 1980, 80 when I dropped out. And so I think what drove me in all that was the connection with people, when the inner workings of the mind, and I'm using mind not as intellect, I'm using mind for anything related to subjective experience. So yes, it would be your thoughts and your intellectual reasoning, but it's equally your emotions, the meaning of things, the memories, the feelings in your body, all of that. Anything that's subjective, I would put under the word mind. And so, how I use the word mind anyway. So I would never say mind versus heart. You could say head versus heart. Sure, those are parts of anatomy, but the mind would include the heart and the belly and all that. So focusing on subjective experience, was liberating. It was exuberant. It had this incredible feeling of vitality to it, even as in a suicide prevention service, even when it's about suffering. And so this is where compassion becomes so um, important, I think, and the beautiful work you've done, Paul, with your life's work. I could turn this around and start asking you questions too about it. That would be fun, and we've had bits of that in our personal friendship. Um, but I'll say that it's the exuberance and the aliveness that came from the connection, in contrast to the experience of incredible sadness and loneliness that I wasn't even aware I was experiencing. I was just trying to survive beyond them and my family. And then in life, you can get lost in familiar places. So as a biochemistry student, it'd be easy to be lost in the lab and just do the work that was kind of fascinating, but not connecting. And that would feel familiar. So I said, okay, this is life, you just do this work. But then, when I came back after dropping out of medical school, and I could literally be a different kind of student than I had been before I left, because I had this conviction. By then I was, I don't know, it must have been 24. So I was older, and I had this conviction that my professors were wrong. Just like I could hold the conviction my father was wrong. And he may have been well intended, uh, but he was still wrong in creating a family where emotions were never looked at, and if they were expressed, they were dismissed or attacked. So it was the whatever the opposite word of compassion is. That was my experience growing up. Um, so when I went back to medical school, and the professors were still, of course, without mind sight, they would ignore the inner life of their patient if they said, "Oh, I have your lab tests and you're dying. There's nothing more I could do. Goodbye." And I would pull on their coats and say, "Excuse me, don't you want to go back and be with that patient?" They go, "Why? I've done everything I can do." I go, "Because you just told them they're dying. And this is a time to be with them." And that didn't, get me any good marks or anything like that. In fact, I was yelled at for doing that.
Mm.
In fact, one of my attendings told me, "I think you're in the wrong school." I said, "What do you mean?" He goes, "You keep on asking your patients about their feelings and the meaning of their illness. You should be a social worker, not a physician." And I looked at him. This was actually before I dropped out. And I thought, okay. And so I applied to social work school and dropped out of medical school. But I don't agree with him. I think there's room for that kind of compassion in all professions, actually. Um, so yeah, so that's yeah. So I think that's what drove me. And that thanks for the question. It's a really inspiring question, actually, because um, when I came to psychiatry, sadly, this was now the early 80s, the field was, I think, maybe feeling threatened by non-psychiatrists really starting to have a big role in mental health. So they could say, "We're medical doctors. What does medical doctors do that other, people in the mental health world do? We prescribe medications. And oh yeah, let's realize that any suffering is due to a brain problem. And if it's a brain problem, people need a pill. That's our specialty. We prescribe pills." And it just seemed to me, when I left pediatrics and transferred over to psychiatry, that was just wrong. That the mind is much more than the brain. It includes the brain's activity, sure. We knew that for thousands of years. That's nothing new. But to limit it to the brain seemed to me to be an error, a scientific error that professionally had economic and maybe emotional drivers to it. Like we're the MDs doing this, and I found that really offensive, I got to say. So I started getting trained by psychologists as a researcher, and when they were asked me to be a training director in child psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, I said, "Okay, I'm going to revamp the whole curriculum and not have the mind be taught as just brain activity that needs a pill." And I don't know if my senior folks over me were that happy with it, but I was in a position of authority, so I could do that. And ultimately, I left when there wasn't room to keep on that line of reasoning. And so when I left, I thought I'd be just a therapist, which was fine with me. I'd stay home with my kids. I'd, have time, just to live a life of, just having things that really mattered. But I couldn't get this out of my system, that the field of mental health seemed to me to be going down the wrong road. And then a book came out, actually by Steven Pinker, that said parents have no influence on children, and the mind is just this, thing that comes from the brain activity, from what you've evolved to have. And he didn't take a very social view of evolution like you do. It was more, a very reductionistic view, in my view. So that got me so energized that I took some of the writings I was working on and turned them into what was my first book, which was basically saying the mind is more than the brain, and here's a scientifically um, rich argument to support that view. It might not be true, but please, as a reader, consider it. And that book gave rise to this interdisciplinary view called interpersonal neurobiology, that started in the 90s with a group I had brought together. And that's what led to this series that I now edit, where we have over 80 textbooks,
Yeah,
in that field. Yeah.
fantastic. So you take it back to a little bit of the beginning of your conversation. So I think what's very interesting is that how compassion can grow from the seeds of suffering. I mean, it's quite interesting that in the Buddhist tradition, the compassion grew not out of the seeds of suffering, but because the Buddha was a prince. Siddhartha was a prince, and then he encounters the three big ones: death, disease, and decay. Says, "Oh, it's terrible. I've got to sort this one out." But often we can use our suffering to launch us into hatred, or to launch us into what's it's launched you into, which is a deep inquiry into the nature of mind, the nature of suffering, the nature of the addressing the sources of suffering, the importance of social relationships as ways of addressing suffering. So I think that's I mean, your story is a very important one about how we can use our own experiences of suffering to launch us into an interest in compassion. And you've done that incredibly well. And the next question I really want to take you into is that on this journey into thinking about the nature of mind, then you wrote this amazing book called Mind. And in this book, you talked a lot about what some people would see as kind of non-duality ideas about the nature of consciousness as the ground of all being. And you talk about the importance of energy, information, and mind. I wonder if you could just open that up a little bit, because this will take us into an area that I want to ask you some questions about the nature of love as the basis of the real ground of what we are. So
Yeah.
how did
Beautiful.
you get into that understand that creation of mind as this information flow, energy, and so forth?
Yeah. Well,
It's
first of all,
it's an extraordinary book.
well, thank you. Thank you for your reflections on that. And I really appreciate it, Paul. Thank you. Um, I think it's interesting to be here in my home office, uh, where we've lived in this home for since the early 90s. And it's when I became the training director, and brought that group together. And in the group, um, the question that brought the group together is, what is the connection between the mind and the brain? And so many of the scientists, there were 40 scientists in the room, would say mind is just brain activity. What's the issue? But an anthropologist in the room, she would say, hold on, we see the mind as, this cultural process. Or a sociologist in the room, he would say, hold on, the mind is a relational process. Don't just say it's the brain activity. And an expert in linguistics would say it is absolutely relational. And they couldn't get along in this first meeting. And so, you know, I, I had brought them all together just because a lot of them had been my teachers when I was a research fellow through the National Institute of Mental Health, studying narrative. And I said, okay, will you please come one more time? I understand there's a lot of tension. There's no agreement. We can say what the brain is. No one can say what the mind is. Um, and no one has a definition of the mind, by the way. We're just saying it's relational. No, it's neurological, but not what it actually is. It. So I said, will you come one more time? And they said, sure. So I went, and since I was the party host, I went out thinking, how am I going to keep this party going beyond just 2 meetings, right? So I went for a walk on the beach, and as I was walking on the beach, I was thinking, how could they both be right? These are really thoughtful, devoted, caring people. They were my teachers, most of them. And I brought them for a party, and I said, could they find the same dance? Could they listen to the same music? But they were saying such different things. So I was walking on the beach and I thought, well, what if they're both correct and they don't have to eliminate the other? What if we could bring the views together? And I said, well, what could be both neurological and relational? What might be? So I'm looking at the waves, and when you look at a wave far away, let's say 200 meters away, and then it's 100 meters away, and then it's 50 meters, then 10 meters, and then it's crashing on your feet. You might think on the surface that a wave is, the water molecules themselves, and that 100 meters out, now 50 meters, et cetera, the molecules are coming to you. That's what it appears like. But you'd be wrong, because the molecules that you see way out there are not what's crashing at your feet. It's the energy. So then I thought, oh, this is really interesting. You have one surface view of what you think is true, but just literally beneath the surface, you realize in this case, it's energy that's traveling toward you.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
So then I'm walking along the beach and I'm going, wow. And the waves are crashing, the waves are crashing. I've been walking on this beach since I was a kid. So then I thought, what if it's energy that the mind is, I don't know, made of or arising from, or something about energy? I don't know. And I said, and I'd been trained in neuroscience, and David Hubel was my teacher. And he had shown, and in fact, got the Nobel Prize for it when I was in school with him. He had shown that energy flow that you introduce to the nervous system gets that nervous system to both be activated in a certain way and to grow a certain way. So I knew that talking about energy flow and the nervous system was very natural. In fact, the brain is an energy transformer, basically. It's electrical energy, ions flowing in and out of membranes, and it's chemical energy, the neurotransmitters that allow neurons to communicate with each other. So that was fine. But then I thought, well, why would energy be a relationship? But then when you take a step back, a relationship is completely the sharing of energy. Like if I go blah, 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 that might be pure energy. But if I say good morning, Paul, it would be energy in a certain formation that symbolizes a greeting. In my case, morning, in your case, afternoon or evening, but because I'm here in the morning here in California. So then I realized, oh, so a relationship is based on information sharing, and it's always riding on energy patterns. So I talked to a bunch of physicists later on, and so I used the phrase energy and information, and because it changes, we call it flow. So I thought, okay, it's ultimately all energy flow. So what if the mind is beyond the energy flow of the nervous system, the brain and the head especially, but the nervous system, the embodied brain? What if it were passing beyond the skull and beyond the skin? And I thought, well, energy isn't blocked by skull or skin. So it could be a mind where the surface illusion that skull and skin are separating boundaries is actually an error. That what we're really looking at is energy flow, whether it's inside the body, and we call that, neural processing or brain activity, or it's between us and then among us. And so then it became, in that week before the next meeting, an issue of starting to read deeply about systems. Now, fortunately, this was 1992. And in 1980s, there was a literature, it's not extensive, but in mathematics on systems. And they talked about complex systems being ones that are open to being influenced by things outside of themselves, capable of being chaotic, and especially being nonlinear, meaning a small input leads to large and unpredictable, or difficult to predict anyway, outputs. And so then I thought, well, the mind has those characteristics. So what if the mind has something to do with a complex system of energy flow that is both internal and relational? And then what if it were, and then I read in this math book that they had proven in the 1980s that complex systems have something called emergent properties. That is like the wetness of water. Something is not in a single water molecule, but when the collection of water in your hand is bumping into itself, it exudes, it expresses this experience of wetness. Not a single element does it, but the interaction of the elements. So I thought, well, if that emergence is a fundamental aspect of complex systems, then maybe the mind emerges from energy flow internally or neurologically, if the brain people want to emphasize the brain, but inside the body and between the body and other bodies and with nature. And then it became, okay, it might be an emergent property like our subjective experience or our consciousness or information processing, of course. But then a fourth facet of mind started becoming clear, which was in the math book. And it said that complex systems have emergent properties, yes. And one of those emergent properties is called self-organization. And I read that. This is all in the week before the meeting. I read that and it said that when self-organization is arising, it leads to basically experience of harmony. It's flexible, adaptive, coherent, all these things, which to me was like the best definition of mental health. In fact, the only definition of mental health I'd ever heard, this flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable flow. Let's just call it harmony. But when you're not in that harmony flow, you go like outside of a river to either chaos or rigidity. And then what I'd been thinking about for years, like, why did every one of my patients, my clients, why did they come with either chaos, rigidity, or both when they weren't doing well? And when they were doing well, they were in harmony. There it was in a math book. So I said, oh my gosh, one of the facets of the mind might be this emergent, self-organizing, embodied and relational process that's regulating the flow of energy inside the body and in the relationship of that body with other bodies and with nature. So it's embodying relational energy and information flow. So when the next week passed and the group got together, I said, hello, thank you for coming. I said, I really appreciate it. I know it was hard last week. Can I begin with offering, a question? Does anyone have a definition of mind they've come up with? No one. And none of the fields have a definition of mind. Certainly mine doesn't. Psychiatry, my colleagues in psychology, no. I mean, no one had it, short of saying it's brain activity. So I said, can I offer you a working definition? It could be completely wrong, but I'm going to offer it to you and let's see how you feel. And let's go around the room. 40 people in the room came for that second meeting. So I said, could we define, at least as a working definition, we'll get rid of it if we need to, that the one aspect of the mind is the emergent, self-organizing, embodied, so inside the body, and relational between the body and things around it, process that's regulating the flow of energy and information. And this was the most amazing moment in my academic career. We went around, 40 out of 40 people voted basically that they had never heard this before, but it fit with their life's work. And they were fine to go ahead. And we met for 4.5 years.
Wow, wow, wow.
That's how, to get deep in the weeds, that's how the whole thing happened. And then, we can talk later on about how, as the journey went on and exploring what that definition, that working definition might imply about what to do in therapy or what compassion was or what consciousness was. And I wasn't a meditator then, but ultimately when I got exposed to meditation, what mindfulness was about, it all had this deeper layer you could understand it through, that the people in those different areas were not speaking in that way. So I was kind of like a fish out of water, even in these different fields, but it seemed to hold together in a way E.O. Wilson might call consilience. It was consistent with indigenous teachings, with contemplative teachings, with different branches of science. It all kind of fit together, still fits together. And that was like over 30 years ago now. So, in these 30 years, no one has come up with an argument against this definition. no one is short of saying, oh, mind is just brain activity. And I said, well, let's talk about that. And then they can't argue against it. But no one has come up with another definition, amazingly. So it's been a wild 30 years. And it seems to hold together as new research comes through in other laboratories and other fields. Bringing it all together, it seems to all fit. And that's been really deeply exciting and rewarding to say, if you can go to this deep level, then what seem like disparate, conflictual views, actually you can find the common ground.
Wow, that's a lot there to unpack. Thank you so much for that. That's extraordinary. And I agree. I don't think anyone's come up with anything even close to that understanding of mind, because the definition itself is interactional. The definition itself requires these interaction of these different elements that you put together in an extraordinary way. And you also talk in your book about the plane of possibility, about how different formations and patterns arise as a process of these interactional systems. Through interactions, these different emergent patterns can arise out of this, what you call plane of possibility. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And Paul, if I'm answering your beautiful questions with too much detail,
No, you're
just
not. You did.
okay. Please tell me. That's fine, Dan. Thank you so much. So what happened basically was, from that moment of offering this definition, you could then move to the definition of mental health, because you could ask the question from mathematics, how do you optimize self-organization? And there's an answer. It's you differentiate on the one hand, allow things to be different or unique, it's specialized in the system. And on the other hand, you connect them, you link them up. So we can simply use the word differentiate for the difference part and link for the connecting part. And when I was working with the mathematicians in this area about optimal self-organization of complex systems, they didn't have a name for the balance of the two. So I chose the name integration. That didn't make them so happy, because in calculus, they were using integration as a synonym for addition. But I don't mean it that way. I mean it just like they mean this linkage of differentiated parts, where in the linkage, you don't lose the differentiation. So it's not the same as addition. That's why they were concerned about me using a math term for general public use, or using for therapists or educators or parents or whatever. So anyway, I understood their pushback, but no one can think of another word. So integration was the word. I'm happy to replace it, if there's a better word. But so far, the word has been fine if you clarify what it means. So integration is clearly defined in the way we're going to use it as both differentiating and linking. So back in the 90s, I moved offices, and it was a nice bigger office I had because I started to teach classes. And I had a table in the office where I wanted the feeling when you entered the room to be like you enter at one level and then you go deep, in the process of therapy. So I designed this table basically with a wooden rim. So when you walk in the room, you see the wooden rim, but then there's a center glass that you go deep to the floor, basically, with your eyes. So I wanted it to be kind of this implicit invitation, like, okay, welcome to the room. We're going deep. We're going to immerse ourselves in the depths, So anyway, so I would do therapy. And then one time I looked at the table and I said, oh, this is an interesting thing, where one consilient idea, is integration is the basis of health. And another consilient idea was consciousness is needed for change. Like, in a classroom, you need students to be conscious. A parent needs their kids to be conscious, to grow and learn. And certainly in therapy, we were using people's awareness all the time and their intentional direction of attention. So I remember the first time I asked a patient to do this, I said, come on off the couch. She got up. I said, we're gonna integrate consciousness. She goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, integration is the base of health. Consciousness is needed for change. So what if we try to do this, integrate consciousness? She goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I said, well, just come to this table. And, consciousness is two things, at least. It's the experience. If I say hello, you have the sound hello and the meanings of that and what it makes you feel and all that stuff. But in addition to those knowns of what just happened, there's the knowing. So let's put the knowing in the center of this table, the glass part. Let's just call that awareness. And let's say the thing you're aware of, the knowns, are on the rim. And there was this thing that holds up the table, the whatever you call it. Anyway, it looks like a spoke of a wheel. So I said, let's make this. And she said, how about a wheel? So I said, yeah, okay. So like it's a wheel, and this is the spoke of the wheel. And so we can move metaphorically the spoke around. So the first segment of the rim will be energy flow from outside the body. The second will be energy flow from inside the body. The third will be like mental activities, which is basically like thoughts and emotions and memories and hopes and dreams and longings, probably from the head. That's the third segment. And a fourth segment, as it's divided in the table, will be our relationships with each other, like a relational field, that energy that you feel. She said, okay. And then we did this thing where we differentiated the different elements of the rim, the knowns, from each other systematically, moving from one point to another. And then it was her idea actually to bend the spoke around and explore the hub itself. So basically I started doing that with other patients. They, like this first patient, started getting over anxiety. I could work carefully with this with trauma. Mild to moderate depression got better. I had a couple of patients, sadly, who were given terminal illness diagnoses. They were freaking out, and in their panic, they didn't know what to do. We did the wheel of awareness, it got to be called. Practice, their panic dissolved away. I mean, it was almost like, this was not a controlled study, right? Because I could, maybe if I brought them a purple popsicle and said, when you eat this purple popsicle, all these things will get better. So we didn't have a control study. Maybe it was a placebo effect. So I started teaching to my students who are therapists. They, like me, started using it personally and found it really helpful in their lives. They started teaching it independently with a lot of skepticism to their clients. The clients started getting better. So I started doing it in workshops. And since I'm a scientist, I would take a recorder. I would record all the responses people had. And this is to explain to you where the idea of the plane of possibility comes from. So I did this with 10,000 people in a systematic way. I gave the wheel exactly the same way in workshops. 10,000 people we counted up. And then before the viral pandemic, I did it with a total in person of 50,000 people. By that time, I had more fun. I could vary it. I'd do it in the beginning of a workshop, the end of the workshop. I'd teach science and then do it, or teach science afterwards. I mean, at that point, I felt like I collected the data. But the first 10,000 was absolutely systematically done exactly the same way. But it didn't matter how you did it. So here's the interesting thing. People would describe things all over this planet, no matter their cultural background, age, profession, education, gender. It was independent of demographics, which was really fascinating. And when you have 50,000 people, you have a pretty wide sample. Now, granted, many of them were coming to hear me. It wasn't like a random sample. So you could say, oh, they're just biased by interest in you. And that could be. Although I have done it in places where I was just popped into a festival and we did it and people had the same responses and they didn't have any idea who I was. So that's a few hundred people like that. But anyway, here's the amazing thing. When people would bend the spoke around, just to talk about that part, they would talk about the experience. They would take the microphone or write me notes. And the most common thing they would say when they would bend the spoke around or retract the spoke or just get rid of the spoke and just rest in the hub. So the metaphor of the wheel gives them the practice of just being in pure awareness. The most common word people would say is love. They would say other words like timeless. They'd say, I was connected to everyone and everything. I was with God. Peace. I was at home. It was empty but full. All these words, Paul, would come up and I would go, this is really interesting. So I look at all the brain research on meditation and mindfulness and all this stuff to try to find a brain correlate that would say, why were they saying empty but full and timeless, for example? And I couldn't find anything really. There was stuff on time in the brain. Empty but full didn't fit with anything, but so I went instead or in addition, not instead, but I additionally went to the literature from physics on energy flow. And I happened to be teaching in Italy with 150 participants who were all physicists. So I had lots of time. We were a week together in this old monastery. I had lots of time to say, what exactly is time and what exactly is energy? And here's this, many of them were quantum physicists. What they said to me was, energy is the movement from possibility to actuality. And then I said, what? And they go, it's the movement from possibility to actuality. I said, I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about, but let me try to visualize this. So I started making a graph of where possibility would be sitting and then how it moves into actuality. And I showed them this graph and they go, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we mean. We've never seen it in a graph, but that's what, if you had to visualize it, that's what you do. I said, well, what's this place down here where all the possibilities are sitting? They go, oh, we have a name for that. I said, what's the name? They go, it's the quantum vacuum. I said, what's the quantum vacuum? They go, yeah. And then one of the people there was Arthur Zions, who's a emeritus quantum physics professor from Amherst College in the United States. So Arthur calls this the sea of potential. And in beautiful poetic terms, but he's a physicist, here's the physics view. It's the formless source of all form. So I said to Arthur, I said, so it's like the generator of diversity. He goes, yeah, absolutely. All the diverse things that arise into actualities begin as potentialities in what you're calling the plane of possibility. So you can imagine what it was like to later in a different setting teach with Arthur about this plane of possibility, because here's what the suggestion comes from the 10,000 person survey, which was done systematically, and ultimately those in the 50,000 person group that responded. Here's the proposal that awareness, the knowing of consciousness, that hub of the wheel and a metaphor of the wheel, looks like it corresponds to the plane of possibility. So if the mind is an emergent aspect of energy flow, and if energy flow, according to the physicists, is the movement from possibility to actuality, then what energy flow means is where you are in this probability distribution curve. The top of the curve is 100%. That's an actuality. Like if I'd say, Atlantic Ocean, I've said Atlantic Ocean, but before I say that, let's say there's a million words, we're in the pool of the million words. You don't know, I don't know, we don't know what I'm going to say. Now I say Atlantic Ocean. There's also not just a peak of Atlantic Ocean, there'd be a plateau in this diagram of the 5 named oceans, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, et cetera. So at the moment I said, Paul, I'm going to say one of the oceans, you would have a 20% chance of guessing 1 out of 5. And now I say Pacific Ocean, and now it becomes a peak. But we could bop down to the plateau, which is a subset of just the 5 oceans. So down, down, down below is the plane of possibility. And that's where all possibilities are sitting as a formless source of all form. And that, I think, explains why so many people doing the wheel say the hub is empty, but full. So then I started meeting with contemplative folks, which I wasn't aware of at the time. And I learned about mindful awareness as all this was happening, because I wasn't a meditator. And I became close with a number of people like Jack Kornfield, who would tell me that in Buddhist teachings, for example, there's a teaching of emptiness. And when I ultimately ended up teaching several times, 5 times actually, with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, the teachings about emptiness are not that it's empty of form, but full of potentiality. And I would say to him, that corresponds to the quantum vacuum. And he would go, well, what's that? And I would, talk basically, I was just at a meeting last week with the monastics of Thich Nhat Hanh's Plum Village. And what was absolutely beautiful was, in the Buddhist tradition, and Thich Nhat Hanh would teach about this, there's called the universal realm, and there's the historical realm, sometimes in other practices known as the relative realm, universal and the relative, or universal and historic. And I said, this really corresponds to the finding in physics where you have a quantum realm of microstates and you have a macro state realm that Isaac Newton talked about, where you do have these noun-like entities of separation. So they were not aware of that whole thing, but this is another example of consilience, and so I believe deeply that from the data of people experiencing the wheel of awareness, just as a systematic, you know, um, context, that when people enter pure awareness, they are entering the quantum realm where the properties are very different from the Newtonian realm. And this is a deep source of liberation in ways we can talk about. So that was a long, long response to your short question.
Wow, I mean, so rich, isn't it? That's extraordinary, rich. But I mean, you tell a beautiful story about how you began to see these whole issues about information flow, and then you began to recognize the wonderful example you gave about the wave and so forth, and then take us into this interest in systems, and then on into this quantum physics, because quantum physics is very odd. Niels
Very
Bohr
odd.
said, if it hasn't shocked you, you haven't understood it. So
Exactly.
fascinating,
Exactly.
fascinating stuff. So,
Yeah.
and yes, I mean, as you know, I'm very interested in, and I think the Nobel Prize last year was won by three physicists who did an amazing study showing about this whole issue about when something is observed, it's different from if it's unobserved, and so on and so on. So that is just beautiful stuff. What I want to take you into, because I'm going to bend you back a little bit onto compassion in a moment, but this issue about when you drop into this experience, the sense of interconnectedness, sometimes people call it self-transcendence, that you are literally a part of everything and everything is part of you. Now, we've done a documentary looking at people who have spontaneous non-duality experience. And the way they describe it is they use the word love, but they also say love is not a good word for it, because it's not like I love you, you love me. It's a totally different experience of this unbelievable sense of being part of all and all part of you, an unbelievable sense of awe and joyfulness. I mean, all of those experiences. So when people have this experience, when they use your wheel, I mean, do you have any sense about what that does to their interest in compassion, in bringing those experiences, using those experiences to bring compassion into the world?
Yes, I'll begin just with a very practical story. Uh, a parliament in, obviously not the United States, we don't have a parliament. A parliament in another country, they've asked me not to say the country. That was the condition of going there. Asked me to do, a day with the parliamentarians. And I've done this in several parliaments. And in this particular parliament, we did the wheel of awareness like we do with all the governmental trainings I do. And, you know, during the snack time after the practice, one of the parliamentarians who was very vocal, a very, very um, got a person with lots of strong voice and opinion. He comes to me, he goes, I didn't share my experiences like the other people were sharing, and took the microphone, were sharing. I didn't share. I go, yeah, I noticed that. You can notice that. He says, do you want to know why I didn't share? And I said, yeah, I'd love to know why you didn't share. And he gets very quiet, and his colleagues are in the other part of the room, and we're having our little snacks in a little corner of the room. He leans toward me and he says, do you know that part where you bend the spoke around into the hub? So I said, yeah, I know that part. And now he gets really quiet and tears are coming out of his eyes. And he goes, I have never felt so much love before in my life. Now there's this silence between us. And he goes, I felt connected to everyone and to everything. And now he's crying. So I'm just listening. Take a deep breath. And I said, wow. And I said, so you didn't want to share your experience with your colleagues? He goes, absolutely not. He goes, if I mentioned love, they would think I was weak. And there's this silence, looking at each other. And I said, so can I ask you a question? He goes, yeah. I said, so are you leaving love out of the reasoning when you make a federal law? When you're establishing national policy, are you not considering love as a factor in your decisions? And his eyes get really, really big. He starts wagging his finger at me, doesn't say anything, and then he runs over to his colleagues. And I just didn't go over there. I let them, and I don't know what they said, Paul, but I can only hope that the experience, not just some person coming to give a lecture about this or that, but the experience he had of, you could say, leaving just the Newtonian world where there's macro states of noun-like entities that are separate from each other, and you can make separation just the way you live your life. When you drop into the quantum realm, which I believe is what the hub of the wheel is, pure awareness is, the reason I think people use the word love, it's the closest we have to linking.
Yeah,
I think love and linking are synonyms, really. And he felt it. I was connected to everyone and everything, he says. And so we can only hope that in the Newtonian world, where you get survival by separation as a noun-like entity, in the quantum world, there are no noun-like entities. There are only verb-like processes that are massively connected. And that's a part of what the Nobel Prize was given for last year. And so what we can say is that, you know, you're born into a Newtonian macro state in a large object, larger than an atom, experience because you're in a body. But you also have the mind that can access the other realm, the quantum realm, from which all matter arises anyway. Don't forget, E equals mc squared. Mass is condensed possibility into a certain, conviction, if you will, certain devotion to being this matter for now, anyway, until it dissolves away. But it's all energy, right? It's all energy. The whole universe is made of energy. Even matter is energy. So in this person's experience, he accesses the quantum realm, which you don't usually get to pure awareness. You're usually aware of something. You have the hub linking to the rim, but you get lost in the rim Newtonian wise. So you just see the world as entities. It's like the surface of the wave. You don't see the true nature of things. He saw the true nature of things, which is love. It's linking. It's verb-like, massively connected processes that we're not separate from each other, that as a government, you make decisions based on love, because love is about linking. The true nature of reality is that we are all connected, not even interconnected, where I'm here, you're there, and we're connected. That's better than not connected. But the idea of intraconnected, we can get into that, but it was the feeling, the experience that when you talk about self-transcendent, and I don't know, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, about how we approach this word self. It's an interesting word to really think deeply about, because self-transcendent implies the self is just in the body, and I'm going to transcend that experience of just being in my body. And that's great. But if the word self means a center of experience, then I think the word, and I've talked to a couple of people who work in this field of studying self-transcendence, I said, why don't we change things like compassion, awe, gratitude, the main self-transcendent emotions? What if we change the overall term from self-transcendent to self-expanding, where you realize we are each other? So if a center of experience is what we mean by self, then why can't we be each other? Why can't, yes, in part, I have an inner self for sure, but I also have a self that's Paul. And I have a self that's all of nature. And in fact, that's the intraconnected whole. And then if we started to live like that, then if I were making national policy, I would always be considering how to really support the self that we all are. So anyway, I don't know what you feel about that word self. It was a big debate I had inside of myself, and a small group I had helping me with writing the book before the book was written. Should we take on the word self and expand, or just say self means the individual and let's come up with another word, or expand self to say it's much more than just the individual? But that's a question I'd love to ask you, actually.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a brilliant question. And of course, it's self. What does it mean? Are you talking about ego self? Are you talking about self-identity? I mean, the concept of a self without the other descriptors is really tricky. Anyway, but we'll come back to you, because this is just phenomenal. And I think we'll both agree that some of what's happened in some of the compassion world, where people have gone on about we need to love people and all that, that's all a little bit nonsensical, particularly But we realize if you just talk about biological brain, then we have oxytocin and we have all these things that can give us a sense of love, but that's not what you are about. I think that's such an important point, right? And this, we're born to, our basic nature is compassion. No, it isn't. I mean, it is in groups, but we're also really vicious, nasty species. And the point that you're making, I think, which is so important, is that however we are doing that because, as the Buddhists say, we are living this illusion. We have our minds dominated by these biological programs that we can't see beyond. But the wonder of your work is to give people an opportunity to see beyond, to experience beyond the biological programs for violence and me and all of that stuff. The question I want to put to you, though, we'll come to your book on Intraconnected because it's a wonderful, wonderful book, is but how do we get this experience, which has to be at the root of genuine change towards love? How do we get this experience out into the world? I mean, how do we get it so that we can do something about horrendous governments all over the world, the Putins of this world or whatever? How can we take this amazing work of yours and make it work to create a more compassionate world? That's the thing I'm interested in. How can we make it work to bring about a compassionate world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple of ideas just to put into the question you're asking, which is such an important question in our world today. The first is something that I learned from Arthur Zions. It's a phrase called pervasive leadership, and it says something I think you'll resonate with. That every human being is capable of making an impact in the world in the various ways that that individual can make. So pervasive leadership means everyone can have an opportunity to contribute to your question, how do we make this work? Whether you're talking about the violence in the world, racism and social injustice, or just climate destruction, all these things are kind of pandemics, if you will. They're affecting all of the planet, all of humanity. So how do we actually have pervasive leadership? That's the first thing. The second thing to say is that your work on compassion, Dacher Keltner's work on awe, other people's work on gratitude, those three emotions, when we take the term self-transcendent and say, well, what if it were self-expanding instead? And what if the way to really address your question, how do we bring this out in the world, is direct experience? Then we could say, well, let's teach compassion, let's teach awe, let's teach gratitude. And you say, well, okay, but how do we do that? So I would say that there are experiences, and the wheel is just one of hundreds of ways you could do this. But I'll speak about the wheel because as a scientist, I've been using it to systematically invite people, in workshops, especially, but more individually in my patients. I'm still an active therapist, and the transformation that people have when they learn the feeling, direct experiential immersion in the feeling of that hub, even if it's a brief dive into it, a brief glimpse, a brief access to it, it starts to shift something in them. Now, as a scientist, I would say, yeah, because they're learning, they're in a Newtonian body of separation, but they have awareness available to them if they cultivate it, where the natural outcome of tapping into open awareness, that hub, is in fact compassion. It's awe, where you go, whoa, what a privilege to be here in this world. It's incredible gratitude. So I think compassion, gratitude, and awe are actually the outcomes of tapping into the plane of possibility, And so in that sense, it's not just let's teach compassion, let's teach gratitude, let's teach awe. It's when we have people learn to be compassionate, learn to go on awe walks, learn to be grateful, they're actually, through that mechanism, tapping into, I think, the plane of possibility. Now, what's exciting about this is then we don't need to teach love. We need to offer direct experiences that can happen relatively quickly, where you tap into the fundamental fabric of the universe is love. That's what you get when you get to the plane of possibility. So, some people say, well, I did that with psychedelics. I go, great. Did it stay with you? Well, no, I got to go back next year and have another. I said, well, you need to learn, this is where the wheel is helpful, because like I do the wheel every day. When I work with people in workshops, or, my students, my patients, whatever, when you start doing this on a regular basis, this is just one example of so many you can try. But for me, the wheel is so helpful, because every day I can take this Newtonian body, say, it's time to do the wheel. It's the morning. I do it before I got on with you this morning. I did the wheel. I'm going around the rim. I'm, aware of this, from the sensations from outside the body, hearing, seeing, etc. I'm going now inside the feelings of the body, in my heart, my lungs and gut and stuff like that. And now, I'm going through thoughts and stuff like that. But then I turn that spoke around, or I bend the spoke. I tried different ways. I just dissolve the spoke. And it's like this shift into this different space that, depending on the timing. Today I had to make sure I had an alarm on, so I could get to you on time, that could, tell me, hey, don't just hang out there. But you don't have to hang out in the hub. But what accessing the hub even briefly does, I think, is it makes it so that you can not live in the plane of possibility, but live from the plane of possibility. And what that means is you're learning from that place, you're leaning into that place. Love is the natural experience in that place. You can lead from that place, right? All these L's in English anyway. So when people do the wheel, because we have lots of students in our institute, and it becomes just, you can feel it, that people start to live this intraconnected way of being, where they have a kind of it's a dissolution of the view that their center of experience, and let's for now anyway use the word self for that center of experience, that has a subjectivity to it, a perspective and an agency. That is, it feels a certain way. That's subjectivity. Perspective, it's like looking through these glasses, it's a point of view, right? And agency, as I'm acting on behalf of something. So, I'm a bit of an acronym nut. So that's an acronym SPA for what you can think of as a scientific view of self. Well, that doesn't have to be limited to your body. And when people do the wheel of awareness practice, or another kind of practice where they access the quantum realm, this plane of possibility, then the subjective experience shifts. The perspective, who am I and what is this all about, shifts. Agency, how you act in the world on behalf of the well-being, becomes very natural. That person in front of you who's suffering is not another self. It's, quote, you, end quote, in that body. And then in the feeling of the connection with nature, when you see destruction in nature, it's like your body of the natural world, that's you, is being destroyed. It's like someone is destroying your foot. So you act on behalf of it. So it's not like, oh, I want to really do good because nature's being hurt. No, you're being hurt because you are nature. And indigenous teachings have taught this forever, and when you look at a beautiful set of documentary interviews, in it's something called Rooted Messages, which I quote in the book Intraconnected with their permission. You see that across the planet, this kind of view of the intraconnected, they don't use that word, but the wholeness that we are nature, it was always taught. So in a way, this isn't new. This is just taking a scientific exploration and kind of independently coming to it, because I didn't know these were indigenous teachings or contemplative teachings, but they're consilient with them. So it's exciting to actually see how they actually all come together from independent sources.
Yes, that's extraordinary. And just to tell people who are listening to this interview that your book, Aware, goes through all of these practices. It goes through the wheel, so you can read about that. But also, you've got some really good YouTubes, which actually will take people through the exercises.
Yeah, it takes you through the exercises. We have on our website this fun moment, Paul, where someone did the wheel in a workshop. she lives right near Sir Isaac Newton's home, his birthplace, and where he went when there was a plague in Cambridge, and left and figured out gravity and stuff like that. So she had me come to England and do the wheel, and you'll see this little film of this. And we did the Wheel of Awareness around the apple tree, paying homage to Newton, and even the quote, there's a quote in his birth home in the hallway. They have a quote from it. It says, I can calculate the positions of the celestial bodies, but I cannot predict the madness of men. And I think that was a good example of, he was doing Newtonian physics. Of course, it's Newton, but he was doing this macro state study because that's what he could do 350 years ago. And he didn't know that now 100 years ago, we'd have the technology to study small things, micro states, not just these large things, the macro states like celestial bodies or apples. So it was a wonderful way where you could see this practice. The book Aware, I think, came out around the same time as that journey to Newton's house. And then there's a little manual of extracts from the big book Aware called Becoming Aware, where you can do like a 21-day challenge, and learn to do the wheel. But yeah, it's a great resource. And the thing that's so interesting about the wheel, it is absolutely a scientifically grounded practice. I didn't know there was something called mindful awareness or mindfulness meditation when I created the wheel in the 90s. It was just the reasoning of consciousness needed for change. Integration is health. What if you integrate consciousness? Here's a table. Let's do it. And that's where it came from. So it's a consilient approach, because my colleague Jack Kornfield says it's a mindfulness practice. I go, yay, that's beautiful. It was starting as an integration of consciousness, therapeutic, reflective exercise. That's what it started as. And I'm happy if he wants to call it a mindfulness practice. That's great. And it does have the key ingredients of, training your attention to be focused, training awareness to be open, and training intention to be kind. And those three things, I was at a research meeting on mindfulness, mindful awareness research, and they couldn't agree on what mindfulness was. So I laid out these three foundations. Half the group said the first two, yes, that's it. The other half said, no, you got to include compassion, kindness training. And the first half said, no, mindfulness does not include compassion or kindness or anything like that. And the other half, so I said, look, you can't agree. How about if we come up with a new name? They said, what's the name? I said, what if you call it 3-pillar mind practice? They go, great. And we got 100% agreement. I don't know if anyone's using that term, but that's what I use.
Right.
3-pillar mind practice is the first pillar, attention to be focused. Second pillar, awareness to be open. Third pillar, intention to be kind. And then you basically have the fundamental ingredients that allow you to see how the brain becomes more integrated with that practice. And when you do those three things over time, you have 5 molecular changes of health. You reduce the stress hormone cortisol. You allow your cardiovascular system to improve the way it functions. You actually have this capacity to allow your immune system to be more robust. The fourth factor that gets changed is you actually decrease inflammation by altering the epigenetic regulatory molecules. That's the fourth way. And then amazingly, the fifth way is you optimize an enzyme called telomerase that repairs and maintains the ends of the chromosome. So you literally, with that and the others too, likely, you slow the aging process. So 3-pillar practice, and the 3 pillars, fortunately, are in the Wheel of Awareness. You usually have them in separate practices, but this is all in one. Those studies, not of the wheel, but of other practices that have those 3 components, they lead to these 5 changes in the body, physiological changes, and the brain becomes more integrated, meaning, your corpus callosum that links the differentiated left and right hemisphere grows more. You make the hippocampus, which links differentiated memory systems to each other. It grows more. The prefrontal cortex behind your forehead, which links cortex subcortical areas like limbic and brainstem areas, body and social world together, becomes more integrated, the prefrontal cortex. And the fourth way that we can show this in research is the connectome. These subtly differentiated areas become more linked. All that to say that the Smith and colleagues paper in 2015 showed that every measure of well-being is actually predicted by how integrated your connectome is, how interconnected your connectome is. So an integrated brain leads to a healthy life, and then you have these other factors too. So, if people want a motivation to do 3-pillar practice, however you do it, the wheel will be one example, but it's important to do and to try to do it regularly.
I think that's terrific. I mean, we're coming to the end now. There's one other thing I want to ask you, but just to highlight that we think about, compassion for self, compassion for others, and being open to the compassion from others. And this is really an approach which is a compassionate approach to you, because it does all these wonderful things that you've just said. If you have a genuine desire to be compassionate to yourself, right, one of the things you can do is these practices, because that is going to produce the results you've just talked about. So I think it's just terrific. And also, of course, with others and so forth. Let me just come wrap up a little bit, because the hour's gone so fast. I can't believe, we're in the quantum world where time has just gone too quickly. This book, Intraconnected, I think would just finish on that, because it seems to be a natural progression from all that you've talked about. And I do want to ask you about an experience that you had that kind of also gave you insights into some of these things in the woods. And then we can talk a little bit about your book, and then we must say goodbye, unfortunately. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience? Because people would be interested in that.
Yeah. I was, I'm very interested in systems, as you can see. And so I've been working with some systems scientists from MIT, Peter Senge, Meta Bol, and Otto Scharmer. And so a small group of practitioners and scientists, we decided to have basically a retreat in the mountains. And so just to set the setting, I was all set to go to this retreat. And then another colleague of mine who's in the field of religion called me and said, Dan, I'm taking 50 religious leaders to a forest in Utah, which is next to Colorado, where I was going with Peter and Meta and my colleagues in the systems world. And the dates just worked out perfectly. So I flew myself to Utah, and we went to this place called Pandopopulus. So I want to start with that so you can get the setting. Right. 48,000 quaking aspen trees, these beautiful, beautiful trees. And you go there. And then when you do this, and in fact, they had me do the Wheel of Awareness in the forest grove, you find out from the naturalist there that it's basically when you go 6 inches beneath the surface of the soil, you find a root ball. And when they test the DNA, you find that these 48,000 trunks are the same tree.
Wow.
So it's one of the largest and oldest living things on Earth. So we were immersed in this for several days, and the Pando experience really struck me about, wow, on the surface, things look separate, but when you go beneath the surface just a little bit, you go, whoa, it's all one root ball, right? So that happened. And then I had to make my way to Colorado. So then I get to Colorado, and, we're with a fellow named John P. Milton, who runs something called The Way of Nature. And we take a couple of days to talk about indigenous teachings and different ways of understanding the nature of reality. And then we go off for 3 days alone, in quotes, in the forest, in separate places. So there were about 10 of us. And so we had 10 different, basically, camping sites where you set up your tent. If some people were not eating, I had to eat. So I would put my food in a bear, can, so the bears wouldn't get the food far from my tent. And for 3 days, you were there with your body there, no other human beings around. So my experience was profound. I mean, after the first, I don't know, day where the sun would set, there was this feeling like I was not, one second. I was not, now here, that's interesting. Another human being has come into my living space. So I'm just closing the door so you don't hear the dog barking to greet her. This body alone there felt like it was not the center of everything anymore. It was like I was the trees, and I was the sky, and I was the clouds, and I was the body, and I was the creek, and I was the water, and I was the stones. It was amazing. And then in the midst of that, one of the other participants came trotting down the next day, the trail. She goes, "Hi, Dan," and that just pulled me out of it. And there was now an identity as Dan. So I said to this participant, I didn't want to speak, but I realized that the others would be disturbed too. So I said, the rule is you stay by yourself for the 3 days. If there's a problem, you know how to reach them, go back the other way on the trail to reach the leaders. So if it's an emergency, no, just wanted to say hello. And I said, bye-bye. And then it took another good 12 hours before the feeling, I am Dan in this body, began to dissolve again. And then fortunately, I could get back to that experience of just being there. And so after the 3 days passed and we heard the bell and it was time to all walk back, we gathered in a circle in another part of the forest there, and everyone was sharing what it was like. And, my wonderful colleagues, were trying to articulate this. They would say things. I was interconnected was a common word that was used. I was interdependent. They used Thich Nhat Hanh's beautiful term. There was interbeing, and all these inter words were said, which was beautiful. And it came time for me to speak at the end of the circle. I mean, I was last in the circle. There's no end to a circle. So I just said, I hear you and I feel what you mean by the word interconnected, but it wasn't like there was an inter, which implies between. There was like a wholeness where I was the forest and the sky and all that. So I guess, I don't know. I don't know what word to use in English. I don't know. And I said, so I guess I was intraconnected. Yeah, that's it. And then it goes, yeah, interconnected. So when I went back to type it out, when we got back to civilization,
Right.
The computer kept on correcting it in quotes, to interconnect. And I thought there was something wrong. Well, there was no word intraconnected. There was no word to speak from the perspective of the whole. And so then I realized that needed to be the name of this book. I was already, working on this idea of, could I do a book on belonging? And then it expanded to this larger idea of identity and selfness, self-experience.
Fantastic.
So that's where the book came from. And, the book took all sorts of different manifestations until its final form, which I'm happy it came to, which included a journey basically through human development to say, when does a sense of self become in modern culture identified with the body alone, this individualism that is modern culture, and what is that solo self, is what we can call it. What is that solo self, separated, isolated way of identifying who you are? What does that do to the experience of belonging? And what's it doing to these pandemics of racism, of violence that you speak about, Paul, of really how we're approaching our experience in nature, where we're destroying nature. So the book really became an invitation for the reader themselves to journey into who are you across your development, wherever you are in reading the book. So it takes you on a lifespan development, and it adds to the indigenous teachings and contemplative teachings, the scientific view that we've talked about the plane of possibility, and then asks you as the reader, would you like to try doing the wheel while you're reading this book, so you can experience the hub and allow what you may have been taught about what the self is, which might be a limited aspect of a larger reality, to be your journey. And so far, the people who've read it have shared with me in a very deeply satisfying way that the book is a kind of journey of transformation for themselves, which I was seeing, how could you have a book invite people to allow them to expand a sense of self? And so far, the feedback has been very rewarding about that.
Yes, it's. I have a confession to make. I didn't actually read it. I actually listened to you
Oh,
talking.
you did? Well, that's
Yeah.
good. That's
The
great.
audiobook is lovely. Actually, you have a wonderful voice tone. So, but you have to go back and listen a
Well,
few times, because some of the ideas are quite complicated. But
well, thank you, Paul. But that's a way of reading. I do most of my reading audiobook wise. I'll tell you, the engineer started, spacing out in the beginning, and I had to stop and go into his aspect of the recording studio and say, "What's going on?" He goes, "I don't know if this book is a book or is it a meditation. I feel like who I am is transforming as you're reading it." I said, "Okay, well, that's fine. Let me explain to you what the book is about, because I need an audio engineer to do this recording well." So he got it, and then he was able to do his functions. But that was an interesting moment because you know it's interesting, a book, and especially if you're sensitive to this, an audiobook can be a kind of relationship
yeah,
that you
yeah,
work out with the one who's reading, and I read it, but also with your inner experience of, wow, who am I? And so anyway, I'm glad it was a really good experience for you, Paul.
precious experience, precious experience. So, look, we've gone over the time, but it's been an absolute delight. And I think that what we can say in terms of creating a compassionate world, you have given us such a fantastic foundation for really changing the ways we think about the whole process of compassion, the whole process of mind. And as you say, there are concepts within the Buddhist traditions that sort of point to these truths as well. But the way that you describe it and pointed it out is just extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And so, you have contributed enormously, I think, to the opening of awareness to help us to get to a more compassionate position, because obviously we can be a pretty nasty species. We need this enlightenment. Thank
Yeah.
you for everything, Dan. If there's anything you'd like to say before we finish.
Thank you. No, I'm so grateful for you, Paul, and your work. And I think that there really is a moment here where, with the violence you're speaking about in particular, I think when people are lost in this Newtonian separation,
Yes,
the violence comes out as a desperation.
yes,
But when
yes,
people get to this, we're calling it the plane of possibility, the hub of the wheel. When people get there, my deepest hope is that desperation will actually transform into connection and love,
yes, yes,
and that it doesn't have to take generations and generations, that this can be a process
yes.
that can happen relatively rapidly, because our world is really needing it.
Absolutely. And it doesn't take 20 years of mindfulness, I have to say.
Right, right,
You
that's
get,
right. Yeah.
it's very rapid, but I mean, it's terrific. And, I'm hoping that the research will continue, your work will continue, your research will continue, other people will pick it up, and it will become really quite a fundamental way of understanding what it is to be human, what it is to be conscious. And it has a whole range of implications, which we're not going to go into today, about life, death, and all these things.
Oh,
And
absolutely, absolutely. My
what
whole
a,
experience of life and my feelings about death have changed after writing this book.
yeah.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what 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 a delight! What a pleasure! So I must let you go to get on with your day now, and hopefully we will see you soon. And once again, thank you so much for everything you bring into the world.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thanks for everything you do and your way of being. It's really a gift to our planet. So thank you.